Our lids open away from the bike, so they can be opened fully without interference, and they create a useful working area. Metal Mule, engineered to be different. Proud sponsors of the bike reviews on Adventure Bike TV.
Now, BMW have got quite a bit of experience in defining or redefining classes of motorbike. So if you were to take, for example, sports bikes on the one hand, where the S1000 RR really defined what a sports bike could deliver. On the other hand, you take the GS 1150, the 1200 and now the 1250, absolutely defined the adventure bike marketplace. But what would happen if you brought the two of them together? So BMW created a sports adventure bike, the 1000 XR. And let's be really clear. And also, of course, this depends on what your definition of adventure is. And adventure, as we always say, is whatever you want to make it. But this is a bike built for adventures on tarmac. It is not a bike built for going off-road. And therefore, really, it's competing more with the Multistrada, the V-Strom, or the Versys. It is a sports adventure bike. It takes its styling cues from both the sports bike, the RR, and from the GS. I can't wait to get it on the tarmac. Possible to blend touring comfort and practicality with sports bike looks and performance. Put the 163 horsepower heart of a sports bike into a tourer. Well, I had the pleasure of the top of the range XR today, the Sport SE. Despite the pretty meaty price tag of 15,250 quid, I don't think you'd want either of the other two models if you were planning on doing any serious hard luggage touring. The Sport SE has the Gear Shift Assist Pro, dynamic traction control, heated grips and cruise control of the Sport model, but then has the luggage grid, the pannier fastenings, main centre stand and preparation for the GPS. Everything you want to get on the road on your tarmac-based adventure. This bike feels light, and that's because it is. Only 228 kilos fully fueled, which should take you on 150 howling miles. And I mean howling. That exhaust sounds pure racetrack, and there's no way you'll want to ride it any other way than howling, unless you get the Acro exhaust, which you should because the original is possibly the ugliest exhaust I've ever seen. Then it'll be leader of the pack howling. It stops rather effectively as well. Class-leading suspension and cornering ABS electro wizardry combined with 320mm 4-piston calipers on the front are super stoppers. Riding this bike is one of the most rewarding, enjoyable and thrilling experiences I've had on tarmac with any bike that had adventure in its strapline. The acceleration is just mind-blowing at any point in the rev range. I literally weighed out loud in my crash helmet when I rode this bike, and the last time I did that was when I first rode the KTM 1190, and before that was when I rode the Multistrada, which says a lot for how amazing this bike is. I need a moment to compose myself. That is fucking something else. That is just... that combination of an inline 4 in an adventure bike with all the electronics, particularly the pro gear change. Oh, it takes me straight back to riding the S1000 RR on a track when I first rode it about 8 years ago. But in an adventure package, that is something else. So you'd probably get the sense from my initial reaction that I'm rather enjoying riding this bike, and I was just trying to think of the best way to describe it. And I think it's a combination of things. So it feels like it's got the flickability of my old Ducati Multistrada, but with the power of obviously the kind of the modern 1000 RR engine, but with the smoothness you get from a inline 4. Now, those to me are an astonishing combination. I am absolutely loving riding it. But what I would say is, if you don't like riding an inline 4, you will not like riding this bike, because it is so different to riding a V-twin or a triple. But I am loving it. This power delivery is in a class of its own, and those sport-size wheels do exactly what they are meant to. They make the bike ride like a sports bike. Speed, acceleration, cornering, stopping, these are just words, and they need a new set of adventure riding additives to make real sense of the fun that this bike is. If you start with the premise that this bike is made for tarmac adventures and touring, and that I like the inline 4 engine, then it's actually hard to be critical. A bit like Cindy Crawford, you can just live with the mole, and I can live with that exhaust, especially if I change it for an acro. I've heard a few comments about vibrations through the handlebars, but I got none of that, especially in comparison with pretty much any other twin-cylindered big adventure machine. Comparisons. It's a bit tricky trying to compare apples with apples with this bike. Riding an inline 4 is such a fundamentally different experience that I think you have to compare this to other similarly engined bikes. If you try and compare it to the Multistrada, well, there's similar power, similar road-biased orientation. Then you just come to a dead end at the engine. And the same with a GS or a KTM Grand Tourer. Either you want a twin or you want an inline 4. The closest comparison might be the Versys 1000 Grand Tourer, but that's 40 horsepower less, and it will leave you with $3,000 to spare. This bike kind of sits on its own, but what a lofty position to be sat in. So there are no two ways about it. I have absolutely loved riding this bike. But before I go into a bit more of the reasons why, there's two tiny niggles. The first one is, despite the fact I love the sound of the exhaust, ew, it looks horrible. And the rest of the bike looks fabulous. And the second one is, the downshifts on the gears, I get a really weird kind of knocking feedback through the clutch lever, but to be honest, those two things I can live with because I love it so much. It takes me back to the days when I used to ride my Fireblade and my ZZR 1100, the 600. Everything I used to love about riding those inline 4s, this bike reminds me of. But in a package that I could just ride for thousands and thousands of miles without any pain in my back, or my shoulders, or my elbows. I really love it. The question is, of course, would I have one of these in my garage? And I think you know the answer to that. The bigger question is, what bike moves out to make room for this?
Welds in aluminium can fatigue and fail over time. That's why our panniers are riveted, like aircraft. Metal Mule, engineered to be different. Proud sponsors of the bike reviews on Adventure Bike TV.